The year was 1873, and Clara Whitmore had exactly 3 choices left in her life. She could stay in Boston and keep scrubbing the floors of a textile factory until her knees gave out. She could accept the advances of a widowed landlord twice her age, a man who smelled of pipe smoke and broken promises. Or she could answer the advertisement pinned to the church bulletin board, the one that asked for a young woman of good character and strong constitution, willing to travel west and become the wife of a rancher in the Dakota Territory. Clara was 22 years old. She had red hair, green eyes, and a stubbornness that had kept her alive since her mother died of fever and her father drank himself into an early grave. She was not afraid of hard work. She was not afraid of distance. But she had never, not once in her life, been west of the Connecticut River. She took the advertisement down from the board and folded it into her apron pocket. The man's name was Edward Hargrove. His letter, when she wrote to the address listed, arrived back within 3 weeks, unusually fast, which she took as a sign of eagerness. The letter was formal and precise. He described his ranch as a working property of 400 acres near a place called Yellow Creek. He mentioned cattle, a small house that needed a woman's touch, and the great open sky that some people found terrifying and others found freeing. He wrote that he was 38, healthy, and ready to build a proper life. He did not mention beauty or youth. He asked about her character instead, and that, more than anything else, convinced her. She wrote back. They exchanged 4 more letters. By the 5th, she had agreed. The church ladies warned her. Her friend Margaret grabbed her arm the morning she packed her single trunk and begged her to reconsider. Women had gone west before and never come back. Not because they died, but because the West consumed them whole, swallowed their names, their pasts, their plans. Clara listened politely, hugged Margaret, and climbed aboard the first train heading toward Chicago. The journey took 9 days in total. Chicago to St. Paul by rail. St. Paul to the edge of the Dakota Territory by stagecoach, which was really just a wooden box on wheels pulled by horses that clearly resented every mile of their existence. Clara shared the coach with a traveling salesman, a young pastor, and a woman named Dottie who cried softly for the first 2 days without once explaining why. Clara did not cry. She watched the land change through the small square window. The trees thinned. The towns grew smaller and farther apart. By the time they crossed into the Dakota Territory, the landscape had become something she had no words for, vast and flat and brutally honest, with grass that rolled in waves like a green ocean under a sky so wide it seemed to lean down and press against your chest. At the last stop, a small settlement called Grantville with a general store, a livery, and a post office, she was supposed to be met by Edward Hargrove. He was not there. She waited 2 hours on the wooden platform with her trunk at her feet while the stagecoach driver gave her a pitying look and the salesman and the pastor and poor Dottie all disappeared into their separate futures. The settlement had maybe 40 people in it, and most of them stared at her from doorways or porch steps, as if a red-haired woman sitting alone on a platform was the strangest thing the Dakota Territory had ever produced. A man finally appeared just before sunset. He was not Edward Hargrove. He was younger, maybe 30, dark-haired, rough-looking, with a jaw like a plank of hardwood and eyes the color of a winter sky. He tipped his hat in a way that seemed more impatient than polite. He said his name was Silas Webb, and that he had been sent by Mr. Hargrove to collect her. He did not offer to carry her trunk. He just turned and walked toward a wagon without waiting to see if she followed. Clara picked up her own trunk. And she followed. She had no other choice. But something about the way Silas Webb refused to look at her made the hairs on the back of her neck rise, and would not go back down. The ride to Yellow Creek took 2 hours on a rutted dirt road that wound through grassland so empty it made Clara's heart feel small. Silas Webb spoke exactly 4 sentences during the journey. He said the ranch was 2 miles past the creek crossing. He said the winters were hard. He said Mr. Hargrove was a busy man. And he said, in a tone that carried no warmth whatsoever, that she should keep her expectations practical. Clara filed all 4 sentences away and asked no questions. She had learned long ago that silence, properly used, told you more than words ever could. She watched Silas Webb's hands on the reins, steady, practiced, the hands of a man used to controlling things. She watched the muscles in his jaw tighten whenever the road dipped or the wagon groaned. Something was bothering him. She had no idea what, and she was smart enough to know this was not the moment to find out. The ranch appeared at dusk, and her stomach dropped. It was not what the letters had described. The house was less than small, it was barely a house at all. 2 rooms, from what she could see, with a patched roof and a front door that hung at a slight angle as if it had been forced open one too many times. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about Edward Hargrove's priorities that she was not sure she liked. There were cattle in a far field, yes, and the land itself was real and wide and undeniable. But there was no welcome lamp in the window. No smell of supper cooking. No sign that anyone had been expecting her at all. Edward Hargrove met her on the porch. He was older than she had imagined. The word 38 had conjured something vigorous in her mind, but the man before her looked weathered past his years, with a graying beard and a posture that suggested the prairie had been slowly bending him toward the earth. He was not unkind. He shook her hand firmly and said it was good she had arrived. He showed her the house in about 4 minutes. He pointed to the room that would be hers, a small space with a cot, a wash basin, and a single window facing north. That night, lying on the cot while wind pressed against the walls, Clara wrote a letter to Margaret in her head. She did not say she was frightened. She was not quite frightened yet. She was something more precise than that. She was alert, the way prey animals are alert when the grass moves without wind. The next 3 days were a strange kind of ordinary. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended things. She learned the layout of the land, the names of the hands who worked the cattle, and the fact that Silas Webb lived in the bunkhouse 40 yards from the main house and ate his supper alone every single night. Hargrove spoke to her at meals in a stiff, formal way, as though she were a housekeeper he had hired rather than a woman he intended to marry. No date was set. No preacher was mentioned. Clara noticed, and waited. On the 4th night, she woke to voices. Low, urgent, the kind of voices men use when they believe no one else is awake. She pressed herself against the cold wall beside her window and listened. She could not catch every word, the wind stole most of them, but she heard enough. She heard a name she did not recognize. She heard the word land. She heard a sum of money that made no sense for a cattle operation this size. And she heard Hargrove say, in a voice stripped of every social pretense, that it needed to happen before the first snow. What needed to happen, she did not know. But the following morning, when she went to the barn to collect eggs and found a locked room she had never noticed before, and when she pressed her ear to the door and heard breathing, slow, human, and unmistakably frightened breathing, she understood that she had walked into something far darker than a difficult marriage. She straightened up. She set her egg basket down carefully on the ground. And she started to think about what she was going to do. Clara did not go back to the barn immediately. She went to the kitchen, built up the fire, and started making breakfast as if nothing had changed. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, water, flour, the iron skillet, while her mind worked at a pace her hands would never betray. There was a person behind that door. She was certain of it. The breathing had been too slow and deliberate for an animal, too irregular for the sound of wind pushing through a gap in the wood. Someone was in that locked room, trying to stay quiet, trying not to be heard. And that meant someone had put them there. By the time Hargrove came in for breakfast, she had a plan, not complete, barely even a sketch, but the outline of something. She set his plate down and asked him, calmly, if the black mare in the 3rd stall had thrown her shoe again, because she thought she'd seen the animal favoring her left foreleg. Hargrove looked up. For just a second, a fraction of a second, his eyes went flat and careful. Then he nodded and said he would have Silas check on it. She watched him eat. She watched him leave. Then she watched, from the kitchen window, as he went directly to the barn, not to the stalls, but to the far end, to the locked room, and stood outside it for a long moment before walking back out without going inside. He was checking that it was still secured. She had rattled him without meaning to. Good. She waited until midday, when Hargrove rode out to the north pasture and Silas Webb was occupied repairing a section of fence line she could see from the window. Then she returned to the barn. She had taken a hairpin from her wash basin and spent the morning bending it into the shape she needed. The lock was old and simple, the kind a woman from Boston with a father who kept liquor cabinets locked was very familiar with. It took her less than a minute. The door swung inward. The smell hit her first, close air, fierce sweat, and something earthy and wild she could not name. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw them. There were two. A woman and a boy, maybe 12 years old. Lakota, by the look of them, the woman's dark braids, the careful beadwork still visible on the edge of her dress despite the dust and the dim light. Both were bound at the wrists with rope. The woman looked at Clara with eyes that held no surprise, no hope, and no fear. Just a watchful, measuring assessment, the look of someone who had already made peace with the worst and was simply waiting to see what shape it would take. The boy's eyes were different. He was terrified. Clara crouched down. She held up her hands to show they were empty. She said, very quietly, that she was not going to hurt them. She did not know if they understood English, and she realized, kneeling on the dirt floor of that barn in the middle of the Dakota plains, that she had never felt more powerless and more certain of anything simultaneously. The woman spoke. Her English was careful and deliberate, each word placed like a stone across a river. She said her name was Wicheringpe. She said the boy was her nephew, Chaitin. She said they had been taken 4 days ago while traveling between settlements, and that Hargrove intended to sell them to a trader who moved people, indigenous people, sometimes children, across territories in exchange for land claims and cash. Clara sat back on her heels. Human trafficking. That was what she had walked into. Not a rough but honest rancher. Not a difficult but salvageable marriage. A criminal enterprise dressed up in the language of correspondence and respectability, using a mail-order bride arrangement as cover, a woman's presence making the ranch look legitimate, domestic, and above suspicion. She cut their ropes with the kitchen knife she had thought to bring. She told them to stay exactly where they were and to trust her. Then she walked back out of the barn and into the sharp prairie sunlight with her heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to escape her body entirely. She had until nightfall. Clara had 2 significant advantages, and she knew she had to use both before Hargrove returned from the north pasture. The first was the horse. Not the black mare she had mentioned at breakfast, that one was Hargrove's, but a sturdy grey gelding in the second stall that belonged to no one in particular, used by the hands when needed and often left saddled until evening. The second advantage was that she had memorized the road they came in on, every bend and landmark, during the 2-hour ride from Grantville. She could find her way back. She was sure of it. She saddled the grey quickly, her fingers clumsy with urgency. She had grown up riding in Boston Common on a cousin's mare, enough to keep her seat, not enough to impress anyone. She loaded Wicheringpe and Chaitin into the back of the small work cart near the barn entrance. It was slower than riding but easier for 2 bound, exhausted people, and she hitched the grey to it with hands that trembled only slightly. They were moving within 20 minutes of Clara first returning from the barn. The prairie offered no cover. That was the brutal, uncompromising fact of it. In the city, you disappeared into alleys and crowds and the overlapping noise of 1,000 lives. Out here, a cart moving across open grassland was visible for miles. She knew this. She drove hard anyway, keeping to the low points in the terrain wherever she could, following the shallow dips and dry creek beds that offered even a foot of concealment. The sky above her was enormous and indifferent. The grass whispered around the wheels. They had been moving for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. 2 riders. She twisted in the seat and saw them, small figures growing fast on the horizon, riding with purpose. She recognized Hargrove's dark coat. The second rider she did not know. She turned back to the road and pushed the grey harder. Wicheringpe appeared beside her on the seat without warning, having climbed forward from the cart bed with a quiet efficiency that startled Clara sideways. The woman looked at the riders, calculated something behind her dark eyes, and spoke a single low command to the boy in the cart. Then she looked at Clara and said, "Turn north." Clara said that north was not Grantville. Wicheringpe said that north was her people. It was the clearest choice Clara had ever had to make, and she made it in under 3 seconds. She turned the horse north. The terrain changed almost immediately, the flat grassland broken by gentle swells and then, farther north, by rocky outcroppings and stands of cottonwood along a river she had not known was there. The riders behind them were gaining. Clara could hear them shouting now, voices carried thin and sharp on the wind. She drove the cart into the cottonwood stand and the shadows closed around them. Then the riders appeared at the tree line, and stopped. Because there were other riders waiting there. Lakota warriors on horseback, still as stone, watching the 2 men from Hargrove's ranch with expressions that communicated, with total clarity and without a single word, exactly how this encounter was going to end if those men chose to proceed. Hargrove and his companions sat in their saddles for a long, terrible moment. The plains held its breath. Then Hargrove turned his horse and rode south without looking back, and the second man followed, and the hoofbeats faded into the grass. One of the Lakota warriors spoke to Wicheringpe. She answered in a long, flowing exchange that Clara could not follow. Then Wicheringpe turned to her and said the warrior's name was Hoxina's father, and that he was Chaitin's father, and that he had been searching for 4 days. The man slid from his horse and went to his son, and the boy, who had held himself together with the compressed stoicism of someone much older, finally broke open and wept against his father's chest. Clara sat on the cart seat with the reins loose in her hands and watched, and felt something shift inside her that she could not name, some long-held tightness releasing, like a knot worked loose after years of pulling. She was still shaking. She was also, for the first time since leaving Boston, completely and entirely in the right place. The Lakota camp was 3 miles north, set in a low valley where the river bent and the cottonwoods grew thick enough to hold the cold wind off. Clara arrived there in the cart as the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and copper that made the eastern cities she had known seem small and colorless. She had expected to be treated as an outsider. She had expected wariness, or at best a careful politeness. What she had not expected was to be welcomed. Witcher-Ingpe walked with her through the camp, speaking quietly, and wherever they went, people paused and nodded, a nod that felt, to Clara, like something genuinely given. She understood later that Witcher-Ingpe was not just any woman. She was a healer, a person of standing, whose return meant something significant beyond the simple relief of safety. And Clara, in whatever imprecise way, was credited with that return. That night, she sat by a fire and ate food she could not name and said almost nothing, because she had no language for the conversation happening around her. But Witcher-Ingpe sat beside her and translated enough, not every word, but the shape of things, and Clara learned that Hargrove's operation had taken 3 people before Witcher-Ingpe and Chaitin. That the land claims he had accumulated were all tied to federal corruption running deeper than one rancher in the Dakota Territory. That there were men in Grantville and beyond who knew, and looked away, and profited from looking away. It was a system. She had been a piece of it, placed there to make the surface look respectable. The anger that moved through her then was clean and cold and entirely useful. In the morning, Witcher-Ingpe's husband, a federal scout named James Hollowbear who worked between the Lakota communities and what passed for law in the territory, rode with Clara back toward Grantville. Not because Clara needed an escort, though she did. But because James Hollowbear had been building a case against Hargrove for 7 months, and Clara Whitmore had just become his most critical witness. Hargrove was arrested 6 days later. The trader he worked with was arrested in Minnesota 2 weeks after that. The land claims were tied up in federal court for 3 years, and Clara testified twice, once in Grantville before a territorial judge, and once in St. Paul before a federal court, wearing her best dress and speaking in a clear, even voice that did not shake once. She did not go back to Boston. There was nothing wrong with Boston. But the woman who had left it was running out of choices, and the woman who stood in a federal courtroom and told the truth was someone else entirely, someone the Dakota Plains had made. She stayed in Grantville. She found work keeping books for the general store, then later teaching in the small schoolhouse the settlement built the following year. The winters were exactly as hard as Silas Webb had warned. The sky was still that unnerving, magnificent width you could never quite grow used to. She grew to love it. Witcher-Ingpe visited twice a year, and in time Clara learned enough of the language to hold a conversation. Chaitin, who grew into a serious and thoughtful young man, once asked her why she had cut the rope instead of walking away. Clara thought about it for a long moment. She said she had not walked away because there had never, really, been anywhere else to go. What she meant, what she could not fully explain to a 15-year-old boy, though she thought he understood, was that there are moments in a life when you see, with sudden terrible clarity, exactly who you are. The question is never really whether you have courage. The question is whether you will use it. She had used it. The plains had taken her nightmare and turned it into the only story she ever wanted to tell. And in the long, cold, star-blazing nights of the Dakota Territory, surrounded by a landscape that owed her nothing and gave her everything, Clara Whitmore, no longer Hargrove's intended, no longer anyone's cover story, finally understood what the word *home* had always meant. It was not a place you came from. It was a place you earned. ****.